Shavuot is perhaps one of the most forgotten about Chagim. It doesn't have all of the rituals. It doesn't have the acts that we associate with the other holidays. And some rabbis think perhaps that's why it's one of the ones that it's become more neglected in our time today in the modern world. Passover, we have the Seder, we have matzah. Sukkot, we have the lulav, the etrog, the sukkah. High holidays each have their own rituals and their own acts. But the ritual, the memory, the celebration of what Shavuot is all about, even though it's a biblical central chag, it's often lost. Minor holidays, modern ones, Hanukkah, Purim, not to put them down. They're not in the Bible, they're not in the Torah, but they have rituals, they have acts. So what is it we do on Shavuot that causes it to be left behind, the forgotten holiday among many? Shavuot, it's not a ritual. It's a moment we celebrate. We celebrate the moment of Matan Torah, the moment of revelation. When our ancestors stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, when they received the Torah. But it's also a moment of confusion. There's a contradiction at play here, a paradox. On the one hand, we are told today to imagine ourselves as if we were there, as if we ourselves stood at the foot of the mountain, as if we ourselves were awakened by the sounds of thunder, the flashes of lightning, that we saw ourselves as witnesses to the fire and smoke as God's presence descended to the mountain, that we heard the blast of the shofar get louder and louder until that moment of silence right before revelation. Just to imagine that we ourselves trembled with fear. We felt the ground and the mountains shake as God's voice called out to us. To us. In fact, the Torah tells us, I made this covenant not with you alone, but with those who are not here with us today. And the rabbis interpret that in the Midrash to say that each and every Jew who has ever lived and ever will live is what that means. They stood there at Mount Sinai and they made that covenant, that brit with God. Each and every Jew. Each of us were there, the rabbis tell us. We're witnesses to that moment. But what's the paradox? So often, we lament about the past. We remember the good old days. We do it in our society as a whole. Psychologists even have terms and ideas and sociologists about why this happens. But we do that. We lament the old days when the sanctuaries were filled, when there were more people that felt a need to be members. It's not a modern thing for Jews to lament about the good old days of the past. It's actually a key principle of Jewish tradition. And that's the paradox. We stood at Mount Sinai, and yet there's a rabbinic teaching that comes up again and again and again called Yeridat Hadorot, the decline of the generations, as each generation descends down from the one before. It's the teaching that each generation subsequent to those who stood at Mount Sinai are in some way lessened than those before them. As we move through the decades, the centuries, the millennia since that moment of Matan Torah, each of us is a little more distant from revelation. And that distance between us and the past, between that moment of receiving the Torah becomes greater and greater. And somehow, because we're further away from it, we're less. We're less knowledgeable, less holy, less deserving of the gift of Torah, less deserving to be a participant in revelation. And this decline, this idea, the decline of each generation is expressed all throughout Jewish law. It's expressed in an idea that current generations can't argue with rulings of generations in the past. It's an idea that dates all the way back to the Talmud. It's expressed in different books by different rabbis. But I think it's said best by Rabbi Zera. If the earlier generations were angels, then we are mortals. And if the earlier generations were mortals, we are but asses. And not extraordinary ones, rather regular, ordinary asses. It's a contradiction. We're told we stood at Sinai, but we're also told we're unworthy of revelation. We're unequal to the generation previous us, let alone going back millennia and more to that moment at Mount Sinai. That's the contradiction, the paradox of Shavuot. To imagine that we were partners in revelation, that we stood at Sinai, and to recognize how far we've come. And as I mentioned, this principle is used in Jewish law to uphold rulings of the past. As each generation moves further and further from the moment of Matan Torah, each generation loses a little bit of understanding, a little bit of authority, a little bit of wisdom. Later rabbis can't argue with the teachings of previous ones. Today we can't challenge the ruling of rabbis who lived a century ago, and certainly not the greats of history this principle teaches. Greats like Rashi and Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, and others who devoted pages and pages to interpreting Torah, to applying Jewish law. And yet the paradox, again, to celebrate as if we were equal partners, witnesses, standing there in the defining moment of our people. The paradox that Torah is the shared inheritance of each and every Jew who has ever lived and ever will. I can say personally as a rabbi, even a student before that, I've never really liked that idea. And I've struggled with it. I'll readily admit that my scholarship comes nowhere close to that of Rashi. I don't have his encyclopedic knowledge of Talmud or Scripture. I don't have Rambam's depth of understanding of philosophical and halakhic topics. Even when I read stories about what life was like at the seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary just 75 years ago, what it took to be a student there, I recognize that many students there went into seminary with more knowledge than many today, including myself, graduate with. So in some ways it's true. Each generation is less. But despite that, I can concede that our knowledge of specific things may be lessened. Our distance from that moment of revelation may be lessened. I can't concede that we have no right to argue with rulings of the past. That interpretations made today, that commentaries, that explanations made today are somehow less valid than those of rabbinic authorities of prior generations. And I can't concede that. I won't. Because to concede that is to concede that Torah has a relevant place in our world today, in our lives. If Torah can't change, if Torah can't adapt to the world that we presently find ourselves in, if it's anchored solely to the societies of the past, it's not a living text. If it's anchored to the understanding, the Middle Ages, of before, each generation then, Torah becomes less relevant to those who inherit it. But that's not my opinion alone. There was a medieval Italian rabbi in halachas who was known as the Rid. And he expressed this position, I think, perfectly. In defense of his own disagreement with a previous rabbinic authority, he cites a philosophical idea with the following anecdote. We admit that our predecessors were wiser than we. At the same time, we criticize their comments, often rejecting them and claiming that the truth rests with us. How is this possible, he asks. The wise philosopher responds, who sees further, a dwarf or a giant? Surely a giant. For his eyes are situated at a higher level than those of the dwarf. But if the dwarf was placed on the shoulders of the giant, who sees further? The dwarf. For now the eyes of the dwarf are situated at a level higher than those of the giant. So too we are dwarfs astride the shoulders of giants. We master their wisdom and move beyond it. Due to their wisdom we grow wise. We are able to say all that we say, not because we are greater than they. It's an old and well-known saying and idea. It dates back over 1,000 years. But perhaps most famously it was said by Sir Isaac Newton, simply, if I've seen further than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. It's not a statement of hubris, not a statement of ego. Knowledge, wisdom, understanding. These things build on each other, generation by generation. The Rid didn't reject the teachings of those before him. He built on them. He added to them for the time and the place in which he found himself living and teaching, the place he found himself responding to that moment of revelation. He was taking what was passed down to him with the knowledge of his day, knowledge generations before him simply did not have access to. I make no claim that I know more than great rabbis of the past, or even countless ones who have been forgotten to the pages of history. But those of us practicing today in this profession, those of us teaching Torah, we are blessed today to live in a time when we have access to those teachings that came before us and those of so many others. Today we have access to technology, information available at our fingertips that was unimaginable to those living just decades ago. And future generations will similarly find themselves in the same position. Dwarves on the shoulders of giants. It's the perfect analogy. It's not that we're greater, but building on what they built, we can see further because of them. Rashi and Rambam, they didn't know what germ theory was. They didn't understand where the sun was situated in our galaxy or in our cosmos. They didn't understand what modern medicine is. It's not an insult. These are brilliant, brilliant thinkers who lived in a time and a place. And today we continue to build on that with new knowledge. Our wisdom is greater only because it's on the foundation of those who came before. We stand on their shoulders. But in doing so, we have a responsibility. Each of us. Each of us. A responsibility to not ignore the teachings that have been passed down, to not ignore the lessons and the rituals that have been transmitted to us from one generation to the next, l'dor v'dor. But we also have a responsibility to incorporate the wisdom of our time, the moral, the scientific, the medical, the literary, the achievements of our day, to incorporate those into the traditions that have been passed down to us. The achievements we're blessed to experience. And to do so is to participate in revelation. To continue to receive Torah as if we ourselves stood at Sinai, participants in that moment of Matan Torah. To abdicate that responsibility in favor of never changing what those before us have said or done. It doesn't honor their legacy, it dishonors it. It's a disservice to the very things we're trying to respect. Because to do so offers a Torah that lives in the past. A Torah that speaks in past tense, not in the present, and certainly not to the future. Not to those living today. It's to offer a Judaism that will increasingly become irrelevant in each generation. We see that sadly happening faster and faster and faster in our world. It's always happened throughout the millennia. But we live in a time where the pace of growth of technology, of understanding of our society is ever increasing exponentially. And so too the pace at which those who find our tradition irrelevant or meaningless, because it's anchored too much in the past, without a look towards the future, abandon it. So Shavuot's about. Our obligation, our ritual is to present a Torah that is living and breathing. Eitz Chaim Hi, we sing as we place the Torah back in the ark. It is a tree of life. It is a living, breathing organism that adapts and changes through the ages to our world, developing and growing through the generations. God says to the Israelites and Moses, Lo bashamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven. It's not beyond your reach. It's not something that you're incapable of following and observing. It's not something you're incapable of touching and holding and changing and adapting. It's not something you're incapable of bringing into your life. That's what this holiday is all about. It's about our duty to continue to develop these teachings. Our responsibility to those who came before to ensure that Torah isn't lost. To ensure that the Torah speaks to the issues of our day. That it's not a Torah used to promote inequality and divisiveness. That it speaks not just to the men who have interpreted the past, but with the voice of the women in our society. That it speaks to those who are gay. That it welcomes people regardless of gender identity. That it offers a roadmap to creating a meaningful life or a family, regardless if the person you fell in love with is Jewish or not. To not do so is to offer a Torah that doesn't speak to so many today. A Torah that's rooted in the past. A Torah that's rooted and destined to perish. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and by doing so, we stand at the foot of Mount Sinai. By doing so, we become active participants in revelation. We are tied to the past. We have a responsibility because of it. We have a responsibility to the past and to those who came before. We have a responsibility to ourselves in the present and also to those in the future. That is what it means to stand at the moment of revelation, to stand at the foot of Mount Sinai. To see that responsibility not just to the past, but to the future. To offer a Torah that is living and breathing. To offer a Judaism that lives in people's lives. It's a difficult thing if we think about the past. Memory, Zachor. The root is found over 160 times in the Torah. To remember the past is a central idea in Judaism. But it's not an act of the past alone. And that's what we're about to acknowledge in a moment as we celebrate or observe the Yizkor rituals. Yizkor, to remember. It seems like an act of the past. But the verb Yizkor is in the future tense. He will remember. It speaks of the future. The service we're about to partake in links the past and the future together inextricably. Just as this is a service to those who stood at Sinai to not keep their teachings alive, we do a disservice to those who came before us, to our parents and grandparents, to those who may have lost, our partners and spouses, our siblings, God forbid our children, to not keep on the values that they taught us, to not continue to live in the world changed because of how they lived, because of the moments they shared with us. So often I hear from people the guilt, sometimes, of not living up to a parent or grandparent's expectations, not living up to the expectations set by the generations that came before. To take our lives in our own direction, to incorporate the values and the best that they gave us, even if we don't live exactly as they may have imagined was best for us to live. It's not something to feel guilty of. It's to stand on the shoulders of giants. Not to abdicate our responsibility to the past, not to ignore what they've given us, but to recognize that they've laid a foundation for us to continue to grow and to build. That's the ceremony we're about to partake in.